The price of silence. Ambassador Sarah Chen had spent 15 years representing humanity across the galaxy, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. The Xena trade delegate sitting across from her in the pristine conference room of Station Harmony was trembling, actually trembling. Though their species wasn't supposed to have the physiological capability for such a response. Ambassador Chen. The Xena delegate's voice wavered through the translator, their iridescent scales flickering in patterns that didn't match their words. We must respectfully decline Earth's proposal for expanded trade routes through our sector. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes fixed on the delegate's rapidly shifting color patterns. After years of diplomatic service, she learned to read the subtle signs that different species displayed when under duress. The Xena were masters of bioengineering, their bodies capable of precise control over every scale and muscle. This involuntary display was more than unusual. It was impossible. Delegate Vexra, she said softly, using their personal name rather than their title, your people approached us about these trade routes 3 cycles ago. The terms we're offering exceed your initial requests. Has something changed? The Xena's scales rippled with a pattern that Sarah's neural translator identified as deep distress, though their vocalized words came through as, we have merely reconsidered the economic implications. The hegemony's existing trade agreements better serve our needs. The hegemony, of course. The massive alliance of elder species that controlled nearly a third of known space had been surprisingly quiet about humanity's recent expansion into galactic trade. Too quiet, perhaps. Sarah had expected resistance, tariffs, or trade barriers. Instead, they'd encountered nothing but polite disinterest. Until now. I see, Sarah said, though she didn't. Not yet. Would you join me for tea before you leave? An Earth custom. No official discussion required. The request seemed to catch Vexra off guard. Their scales settled into a pattern of confused appreciation as they agreed. Minutes later, in Sarah's private office aboard the station, she watched as the Xena delegate examined the steaming cup before them with genuine curiosity. It's called oolong, Sarah explained, sipping from her own cup. From my grandmother's farm in Taiwan. She paused, then added quietly, no monitoring devices can function in this room. Something about the quantum shielding interfering with most surveillance technology. Fascinating quirk of physics, really. Vexra's scales froze in a pattern Sarah had never seen before, the delegate's upper eyes fixed on her, while their lower set darted around the room. When they spoke, their voice was barely a whisper. You noticed too much, Ambassador Chen. That could be dangerous. I noticed that a species renowned for their physical control is showing signs of severe stress, Sarah replied evenly. I noticed that a trade deal that would have brought prosperity to both our peoples is being rejected without logical cause. And I noticed that every time I mention the hegemony, your scales display patterns associated with fear. The cup in Vexra's hand shook, tea nearly spilling. Please, they whispered, you don't understand. They're watching. They're always watching. Sarah set her cup down carefully. Then help me understand. Whatever's happening, Earth can. No. Vexra's scales flashed warning patterns so bright they nearly hurt to look at. You must not interfere. The hegemony. They control everything. The trade routes, the communications, They stopped abruptly, scales dimming to a dull gray. The people. Sarah finished softly. Vexra's silence was answer enough. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach as the pieces clicked into place. The hegemony's unusual passivity toward human expansion. The Xena's sudden withdrawal from multiple trade agreements. The strange patterns she'd noticed in their society during her last diplomatic visit. The absence of young Xena in public spaces. The strict scheduling of all citizen movements. How long? She asked. 3 of your Earth years, Vexra replied, their scales now showing a pattern of deep grief. They came with their ships and their demands, said our bioengineering capabilities could serve the greater good of the galaxy. We refused. The delegate's voice cracked. They took our children first. Entire creches, gone overnight, said they were being relocated for specialized education. Then came the neural controls, the behavior modifications, the regulatory oversight of all our major cities. Sarah's hand tightened around her cup. Why hasn't anyone spoken out? The Galactic Council is bound by procedure and evidence, Vexray interrupted. The hegemony controls all our communications, all our data. Any evidence of their control is classified as internal security matters. And we cannot fight back. They've modified us, changed us. Even thinking of resistance causes pain now. Sarah stood slowly, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. The hegemony had hidden this slavery behind a web of bureaucracy and behavioral conditioning. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed humanity would play by the same rules as every other species in the galaxy. Vexray, she said carefully, I'm going to ask you something important. The neural controls, the behavior modifications, do they extend to preventing you from accepting help if it's offered? The delegate's scales shifted through several patterns rapidly before settling on a complex swirl that Sarah's translator couldn't interpret. They did not think such a scenario was possible. We are prevented from asking for help, from fighting back, from speaking of our condition. But they did not think to prevent us from accepting aid freely offered. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Classic authoritarian oversight. They'd been so focused on preventing uprising from within that they'd failed to account for intervention from without. Then, speaking purely hypothetically, if someone were to notice discrepancies in your society's behavior and begin investigating. We could not help them, Vexray interrupted, could not provide information or assistance. Their scales flickered briefly, but we could fail to prevent such investigation, could be inefficient in stopping it. Sarah nodded slowly. I understand. She walked to her desk and pressed a button, causing a holographic display to spring to life. I need to file my report on our failed trade negotiations. Standard procedure requires extensive documentation of any unusual behaviors or discrepancies noted during the talks. It may take several hours to complete all the necessary forms. Vexray's scales shifted to a pattern of cautious hope. Of course, Ambassador, diplomatic thoroughness is admirable. I find myself suddenly quite tired. Perhaps I could rest here while you work. The tea is most soothing. Of course, Sarah replied, her fingers already flying over the holographic keyboard. Take all the time you need. And Vexray. The delegate's 4 eyes focused on her. Humanity has a long history of noticing things we're not supposed to see, and an even longer history of doing things we're not supposed to do. As she began composing her report, carefully coded warnings and observations that would set wheels in motion back on Earth, Sarah thought about the lessons of human history. The hegemony had built their control on rules, regulations, and the assumption that everyone would follow proper procedures. They were about to learn that humanity had a very different set of rules when it came to confronting injustice, and proper procedures had never stopped them from doing what was right. The game was about to change, and the hegemony didn't even know they were playing yet. Breaking chains. Captain Maya Rodriguez adjusted her merchant ship captain's uniform, a convenient cover for a naval intelligence operative, as she guided her vessel through the crowded space lanes of Zena Prime's orbital stations. The ship's transponder identified it as the free trader Lucky Star, just another independent cargo hauler making its rounds through regulated space. The hegemony customs official reviewing her approach vector had no way of knowing that the ship's hull contained sophisticated sensor arrays hidden beneath its weathered exterior, or that its cargo holds concealed something far more valuable than the industrial polymers listed on its manifest. Lucky Star, you are cleared for docking at Bay 47C. The official's bored voice crackled through the comm. Maintain prescribed approach vector. Deviation will result in immediate security response. Acknowledged control, Maya responded, keeping her voice casual despite the tension coiling in her stomach. Bay 47C, prescribed vector, no deviations. Just another day hauling polymers. As she guided the ship toward its assigned berth, Maya's trained eye noted the patrol patterns of hegemony security vessels. Their movements seemed random at first glance, but she'd spent weeks analyzing their routines. There was a gap in coverage every 43 minutes that lasted exactly 17 seconds, barely enough time for a small shuttle to slip through, if its pilot was skilled enough and either brave or foolish enough to try. The Lucky Star settled into its berth with a gentle thud. Right on schedule, a team of hegemony inspectors boarded to begin their security sweep. Maya greeted them with the practiced irritation of a merchant captain, losing valuable time to bureaucracy. "The manifest's all in order," she said, handing over a data crystal. "Same as the last 3 times I've made this run. Can we speed this up? I'm burning fuel here." The lead inspector, a towering insectoid species Maya recognized as a Kithtal, chittered something that the translator rendered as vague disapproval. The inspection proceeded exactly as it had during her previous visits, thorough but ultimately superficial, focused on checking boxes rather than finding anything actually hidden. The hegemony's greatest weakness, Maya had learned, was their own sense of superiority. They were so convinced of their technological supremacy that they never imagined someone might beat their scanners with techniques that were almost primitive by comparison. The sensor-blocking materials lining certain compartments of her ship weren't advanced technology. They were literally old-fashioned lead sheets, backed up by carefully calculated electromagnetic fields that created sensor shadows exactly where they needed them. 4 hours later, with the inspection complete and her cargo officially cleared for unloading, Maya made her way to what appeared to be a standard merchant's bar in the station's commercial sector. She ordered a drink she had no intention of finishing and settled into a booth designed to accommodate multiple species. Right on schedule, a Xena maintenance worker appeared to clean the adjacent table. Without looking up from their work, the Xena scales flickered in a pattern that Maya's specialized translator rendered as, "The children are being moved tomorrow. Krish 7. The pain is worse now when we think about it, but we think about it anyway." Maya appeared to take a sip of her drink, subvocal implant transmitting her words directly to the Xena's own hidden translator. "We'll be ready. Maintenance shaft 42B, 3rd shift change. Watch for the flicker in the power grid." The Xena's scales rippled acknowledgement before they moved on to another table. Maya waited exactly 17 minutes before leaving, paying with untraceable credits and making her way back to her ship through a carefully randomized route that would defeat pattern recognition surveillance. Back in the supposed safety of the Lucky Star, Maya accessed a heavily encrypted quantum channel hidden within the ship's standard communication suite. "Phase 1 confirmation," she transmitted. "Package location verified. Delivery window identified." The response came back almost instantly. "Acknowledged. Support teams in position. You have operational autonomy. Good hunting, Captain." Maya allowed herself a grim smile as she began preparations for what would happen next. The hegemony had spent years building their system of control, layering technology and bureaucracy into an oppressive web that kept the Xena firmly under their power. But they'd never faced an enemy like humanity, a species that had spent its entire history learning to fight against overwhelming odds, to find ways around seemingly impenetrable defenses, and to turn an opponent's strengths into weaknesses. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of careful preparation disguised as routine cargo operations. Maya's crew, all highly trained special operations personnel despite their carefully crafted appearances as ordinary merchant spacers, moved with precise efficiency, every action calculated to appear completely normal to the watching eyes of the hegemony. When the station's chronometers marked the start of 3rd shift, Maya was in her captain's chair, watching multiple encrypted feeds from hidden sensors throughout the station. Right on schedule, a slight flicker ran through the power grid, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and completely deniable as a routine power fluctuation. Deep in the station's maintenance sections, 23 Xena children from Krichstone were being hurriedly, but quietly moved to a new educational facility. Their guards, confident in their neural controls and behavior modifications, had grown complacent. They never noticed that their prescribed route would take them directly past maintenance shaft 42B exactly during that momentary power fluctuation. They also never noticed the precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulse that disabled their neural control transmitters for exactly 4.2 seconds. In those few seconds, panels opened in the shaft walls. The children vanished into passages that shouldn't have existed, guided by Xena maintenance workers whose neural controls had been subtly modified over weeks of careful work by resistance technicians. By the time the guards realized something was wrong, their charges had vanished completely. Maya's hands flew across her control panels as alarms began to blare throughout the station. With practiced precision, she initiated the Lucky Star's emergency departure protocols, a perfectly reasonable response for a merchant captain spooked by sudden security alerts. As her ship backed out of its berth, its sensor-shielded cargo holds now containing precious living cargo instead of industrial polymers, she allowed herself a moment of fierce satisfaction. The hegemony would learn nothing from their investigation. The children would appear to have vanished impossibly, leaving no evidence of how they'd been taken or where they'd gone. The maintenance workers would show no sign of having broken their neural conditioning. Every sensor log, every security recording, every system would show exactly what it was supposed to show. But 23 Xena children were now on their way to freedom, the first of many. And more importantly, the myth of the hegemony's perfect control was beginning to crack. As the Lucky Star accelerated away from the station, Maya sent one final encrypted burst transmission. Phase 1 complete. Beginning Phase 2 preparations. The liberation of the Xena was far from complete, but humanity had struck its first real blow against the hegemony's control. They had proven that no system of oppression was perfect, no control absolute. And they were just getting started. The real war, the one the hegemony didn't even know was coming, was about to begin. The storm breaks. Admiral James Chen, Sarah Chen's brother, stood before the assembled Galactic Council, his dress uniform pristine, his expression carved from stone. The council chamber's vast dome stretched above him, its ancient walls inscribed with the laws and principles that supposedly govern civilized space. The gathered representatives of 200 species waited in tense silence as human technicians finished setting up their presentation. Distinguished representatives, James began, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was about to unleash. 3 years ago, my sister discovered something that should have been impossible in our modern age. Today, we present evidence of crimes that cannot be ignored and demand action that cannot be delayed. The main holographic display flared to life, showing a detailed tactical map of hegemony space. But instead of military installations or trade routes, it displayed something far more damning. A vast network of control centers, behavior modification facilities, and neural suppression broadcasts that blanketed every Xena world. For 3 years, James continued, the hegemony has enslaved the entire Xena species through technological means, using neural controls and behavior modification to create a facade of willing cooperation. But facts have a way of emerging, no matter how deeply they're buried. The display shifted, showing compiled sensor data, intercepted communications, and most devastatingly, testimony from rescued Xena children, their neural controls carefully removed, describing the systematic enslavement of their people. The council chamber erupted in shocked murmurs and exclamations. The hegemony's representative, a tall, ethereal being named Vorax, rose in protest. This is absurd. These supposed revelations are clearly fabricated. The Xena are valued members of the hegemony, participating willingly in our collective prosperity. We demand. James cut him off by playing a recorded hologram. It showed Vorax himself, speaking candidly to his subordinates. The neural control network is operating at 98% efficiency. The Xena's resistance has been completely suppressed. Soon, their bioengineering capabilities will be entirely at our disposal. The chamber exploded into chaos. Vorax's own scales, so similar to the Zena's, flashed patterns of rage and fear. This recording is a fake, and even if these absurd allegations were true, humanity has no standing to interfere in hegemony internal affairs. Internal affairs. James's voice cut through the tumult like a blade. Let me show you what internal affairs looks like. The display changed again, showing real-time footage from across Zena space. Human warships, hundreds of them, decloaking in precise formation around key hegemony control installations. But these weren't the sleek, elegant vessels the galaxy was used to seeing. These were weapons of war, built by a species that had never forgotten how to fight. Humanity's fleet is now in position around every major neural control center in hegemony space, James announced. We have already transmitted the shutdown codes extracted from your own databases. The neural control network will be deactivated in exactly 1 minute. We're not here to ask permission. We're here to inform the Council that the liberation of the Zena begins now. Vorax's voice rose to a shriek. This is an act of war. You have no authority. No, James interrupted, his voice hard as steel. This is an act of justice, and humanity has always had the authority to oppose slavery, regardless of who practices it or how they disguise it. On the display, the countdown reached 0. Across Zena space, neural control transmitters went dark. Behavior modification centers stopped broadcasting, and for the first time in 3 years, the Zena people felt their minds become truly their own. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Zena across 100 worlds began dismantling the hegemony's control infrastructure. Security forces found themselves facing crowds of newly liberated citizens whose neural controls no longer forced compliance. The hegemony's perfect system of control collapsed in minutes. 3 hours ago, James continued over the pandemonium in the council chamber. We transmitted all of our evidence to every major news network and information exchange in known space. The truth cannot be hidden any longer. And now, humanity presents the council with a choice. He paused, looking each council member in the eye. You can either stand with us in ensuring the Zena's permanent freedom, or you can stand with the hegemony and be treated as complicit in their crimes. Choose carefully. Humanity's patience with institutional injustice has its limits. The council chamber erupted into frantic discussion. But James noticed that most representatives were already distancing themselves from the hegemony delegation. They could see which way the wind was blowing. On his secure command channel, James received confirmation from the fleet. The hegemony's military forces were scrambling to respond, but they were too late. Humanity's ships had already secured their objectives. The neural control network was gone, and with it, the hegemony's hold over the Zena. Admiral, his tactical officer reported, hegemony warships are mobilizing from their nearby bases. They'll be in weapons range within 20 minutes. James allowed himself a grim smile. Good. Let them come. It's time they learned that humanity doesn't just fight wars. We win them. The storm had broken. Now it was time to show the galaxy why Earth's warships had been built to wage war, not just patrol space. The hegemony was about to learn what humanity's veterans had known for centuries. The most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most advanced technology, but the one fighting for a cause they believe in with absolute conviction. The real battle was about to begin, and humanity was ready. The art of human war. The hegemony's grand fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their ships arranged in the classical Theta assault pattern that had dominated galactic warfare for millennia. 5,000 vessels, each one a masterpiece of advanced technology, their weapons capable of reducing planets to ash. Admiral Xerxes watched from his flagship's command deck, his crystalline form pulsing with anticipated victory. The humans have violated every convention of civilized warfare, he announced to his command staff. They will learn why the hegemony has maintained peace in this sector for 10,000 years. Begin the attack pattern. His tactical officer interrupted, voice tight with confusion. Admiral, we're detecting no human ships in the system. Our intelligence indicated their main fleet was gathered here. But, because it was, came a new voice over their command channel. Admiral James Chen's hologram appeared on their bridge, his expression almost pitying. 12 hours ago. Welcome to your first lesson in human warfare, Admiral Xerxes. Never be where your enemy expects you to be. The space around the hegemony fleet suddenly bloomed with thousands of small signals. What had appeared to be debris and asteroidal matter began moving with purpose. Humanity's fleet hadn't fled. They'd scattered into smaller units, powering down to near invisible levels, waiting in the perfect ambush position. Lesson 2. James continued as human ships launched their first strikes from all directions. Never assume technology alone wins wars. The hegemony fleet's perfect formation became their undoing. Packed together for maximum firing coordination, they had no room to maneuver as human vessels attacked from every angle. Their advanced shields, calibrated to stop energy weapons, proved surprisingly vulnerable to mass-driver rounds accelerated to relativistic speeds. Their sophisticated targeting systems, designed to track energy signatures, struggled to lock onto ships using minimal power. Impossible. Xerxes raged as the first wave of casualties mounted. Your vessels are inferior. Your technology is primitive. You cannot. Lesson 3. James interrupted. Warfare isn't about having the best tools. It's about how you use them. Human ships demonstrated this principle with devastating efficiency. Their vessels, appearing crude and primitive to hegemony sensors, revealed layers of tactical sophistication. What seemed like random debris turns out to be clouds of smart minds, activating only when hegemony ships passed nearby. Electronic warfare suites, built on principles so old the hegemony had forgotten they existed, played havoc with their quantum targeting systems. But the real surprise came when the hegemony launched their primary weapon systems, planet-killing beams that could slice through any known defense. The human ships didn't even try to defend against them. Instead, they used the beam's own power against them, their primitive hull materials reflecting and refracting the energy in ways that turned space itself into a weapon. Lesson 4. James continued as hegemony ships began exploding under their own reflected firepower. Sometimes the best defense isn't to block an attack, but to redirect it. The battle that followed would be studied in war colleges across the galaxy for centuries to come. The hegemony's superior technology and perfect formations met humanity's adaptive tactics and unconventional thinking. Ships that should have been easy prey turned into deadly predators. Weapons that had dominated space warfare for millennia found themselves countered by strategies no one had considered before. You're fighting wrong. Xerxes shouted in frustration as another battle group disintegrated under surprisingly effective human attacks. These tactics violate every principle of strategic combat. Lesson 5. James replied, his voice now hard as steel. There are no rules in real war except survival and victory. As if to emphasize this point, human vessels began executing maneuvers that seemed suicidal, until they worked. Ships deliberately took hits to their armored sections, using the impact to spin into better firing positions. Smaller craft slipped through gaps in hegemony formation that should have been too small to survive, delivering devastating close-range attacks. But the true turning point came 3 hours into the battle, when the hegemony finally realized what humanity's real strategy had been. All this time, while their main fleet was engaged in this sector, smaller human task forces had been striking critical hegemony installations across their territory. Supply lines were cut, command centers disabled, and most importantly, their remaining neural control infrastructure was being systematically destroyed. Final lesson. James announced as reports of widespread revolts began reaching the hegemony fleet. Never forget why you're fighting. Technology, tactics, strategy, they're all just tools. The real weapon is conviction. We're not fighting for territory or resources or even revenge. We're fighting because what you did was wrong, and we're going to make it right. The battle ended not with a devastating final blow, but with a series of surrenders. Hegemony ship captains, seeing their support infrastructure crumbling and their forces being systematically dismantled, began standing down. Some even turned their weapons on those who tried to continue fighting. Admiral Xerxes watched in disbelief as his perfect fleet disintegrated not just physically, but philosophically. "How?" he demanded. "How did you defeat our superior technology?" "We didn't," James replied simply. "We defeated your assumptions. You thought advanced technology made you invincible. You forgot that every tool, no matter how powerful, is only as good as the thinking behind its use. Humanity hasn't forgotten how to think like survivors, like warriors, like people fighting for something bigger than themselves." As the remaining hegemony ships surrendered, James allowed himself a small smile. The battle was over, but more importantly, the message had been sent. The galaxy now understood that humanity's strength wasn't in their ships or weapons, but in their willingness to think differently, to adapt, and to fight with absolute conviction when justice demanded it. The age of the hegemony's unchallenged dominance was over. A new era was beginning, shaped by a species that remembered what so many had forgotten. The most powerful force in any conflict isn't technology, but the unbreakable will to use it wisely and justly. A new dawn. 1 year after the Battle of Hegemony Prime, Sarah Chen stood once again in the Galactic Council chamber. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Vexra, the Xena delegate whose trembling scales had first revealed the truth of their people's enslavement. But now those scales shimmered with patterns of strength and pride, free from the neural controls that had once suppressed their will. The chamber itself had changed. Where once the hegemony's representatives had dominated proceedings from their elevated seats, now a more egalitarian arrangement prevailed. The remaining hegemony worlds, those that hadn't descended into civil war or declared independence, occupied a much humbler position among the gathered species. The liberation and reconstruction efforts continue on schedule, Sarah reported to the assembled representatives. The last of the neural control infrastructure has been dismantled. The Xena Medical Corps, working with human scientists, has developed treatments for the lingering effects of long-term behavioral modification. Most importantly, the Xena people are free to chart their own course again. Vexra stepped forward, their scales displaying patterns of such complex emotion that most translator systems simply rendered them as profound. "We have learned much from this experience," they addressed the council. "About oppression, yes, but also about hope. About the danger of assuming that technological advancement equals moral advancement. And about the importance of having allies willing to fight for what's right, not just what's convenient." The chamber had changed in other ways too. Representatives who had once automatically deferred to the eldest species now spoke their minds freely. The human victory over the hegemony had shattered more than just their military power. It had broken the assumption that age and technological superiority automatically conferred the right to rule. But perhaps the most important lesson, Vexra continued, is one that humanity has taught us all. True civilization isn't measured by the elegance of our ships or the power of our weapons. It's measured by what we do with that power and who we choose to be. Sarah watched as the council members absorbed these words. She could see the change in them, the new willingness to question, to challenge, to think differently. The hegemony's fall had created space for new ideas, new approaches to galactic civilization. "Which brings us to our proposal," Sarah said, activating a holographic display. "The Xena people, with Earth's full support, wish to establish what we're calling the Galactic Liberation Archive. This facility will serve 3 purposes. First, to preserve the historical record of what happened, ensuring that future generations never forget the price of complacency in the face of oppression." The display showed plans for a vast complex on one of the former hegemony worlds, its architecture combining Xena crystal tech with human pragmatic design principles. Second, she continued, to serve as a research and development center where species can share knowledge freely, focusing on using technology to enhance freedom rather than control. Already, the combination of Xena bioengineering and human adaptive thinking has produced breakthroughs in medical science and environmental restoration. Images flashed showing joint human Xena teams working on everything from planetary rehabilitation to new forms of faster-than-light travel that didn't require the massive infrastructure hegemony had once used to control trade routes. And third, Sarah concluded, to house a rapid response force drawn from all member species, dedicated to preventing any future attempts at systematic oppression, not through technological dominance or control, but through cooperation, vigilance, and the shared commitment to protecting sapient rights. The council chamber erupted in discussion, but it wasn't the chaos of the past. Representatives debated points respectfully, offered amendments and suggestions, engaged in genuine dialogue. The change was profound, from a body that had rubber-stamped hegemony decisions to one actually governing through consensus. Later, in a quiet garden area designed for multiple species to find comfort, Sarah and Vexra watched the twin suns of the council world set. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Vexra asked, their scales showing patterns of contemplative joy. "When you first noticed my trembling scales, did you think it would lead to such change?" Sarah smiled, remembering that moment that had set everything in motion. "Honestly, no. I just knew something was wrong, and that we had to help. Everything else, the war, the liberation, this new coalition, it all grew from that simple imperative. See wrong, do right." Such a human perspective, Vexra noted, their scales flickering with amused affection. So simple, yet it reshaped the galaxy. "That's humanity for you," Sarah replied. "We're not the most advanced species, or the wisest or even most powerful, but we remember things others have forgotten, like the importance of questioning authority, standing up for what's right, and never, ever accepting that injustice is just the way things are." As darkness fell, lights began coming on in the council complex, but they weren't the harsh, uniform illumination of the old days. These lights varied in color and intensity, accommodating the different visual needs of various species. A small change, perhaps, but symbolic of the larger transformation. A new dawn, Vexra mused, watching the play of lights. Not just for the Xena, but for all species. A new dawn, Sarah agreed. And this time, we'll face it together, standing as equals under these stars we share. In the years that followed, the galaxy would indeed change. The Liberation Archive would become a beacon of hope and progress, its principles spreading far beyond its walls. Species that had once competed began to cooperate, finding strength in their differences rather than seeking to dominate through them. And while challenges remained, as they always would, the galaxy had learned its lesson well. True civilization isn't built on control or superiority, but on justice, cooperation, and the courage to stand up for what's right. It was a lesson taught by a supposedly primitive species, written not in elegant theorems or advanced technology, but in the simple, unshakable conviction that all sapient beings deserve to be free. The era of the hegemony was over. The age of liberation had begun.